here in Utah. It's my first trip, and I just want to let you know that there is a quiz at the end of this. So I escaped 4 regulatory agencies. They occasionally let us out of the cage, but I have lessons from each of them, and the FDA is arguably my favorite. And I put this picture on here to start because I think about the future, and I think of the FDA as the gateway to a future. This is from the movie The Arrival. It's an automated surgical bay. So in the movie, the actor's injured, goes into the bay, gives them an automatic CT scan, they press a bunch of buttons, and it automatically does surgery and repairs them. And my dream is that someday that this is a device that's available for consumers. And so in the US, we have lots of problems. I put a couple of them on here. We have 30 million people who still smoke combustible tobacco. We have challenges with food, obesity. And today I'm going to talk mainly about drugs, devices, and diagnostics. I'm going to set food and tobacco aside. And we have lots of problems. If you're a patient in the US, you have lots of functional barriers. Half of patients with heart failure can't get upstairs. Imagine if you wake up in the morning and you live in a 2-story house and you can't go upstairs. So I'm practicing hospitalist. I've had patients who only live on the 1st story of their house. They can't go into the basement and do laundry. They can't go upstairs. They can't go out into their garden. And imagine, of course, if you have a disease for which there is no treatment. And the thing that's interesting about the FDA is that the FDA sets the clinical standard. So in Washington, where I'm from, unfortunately, Washington uses tools that it knows well. We use laws, rules, and regulations and think about protecting the public health. I say that the FDA has a different mission. The FDA's mission should be to facilitate safe and effective innovation for patients. We need to think about how we decentralize regulatory authority, how we promote personalization and customization, and how we automate, and I'll get into that. Unfortunately, what happens too often in Washington is we use things that we know pretty well. We transfer wealth from one industry to another. We write 2,000-page rules at CMS. Anyone enjoy reading those? I don't, although I have to. And we don't think about what it is that the agency is actually doing. We often forget what it is to be a patient, what it is to be a physician. I'm an internist. Every drug that I prescribe was developed by somebody else. It took years, hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, thousands of people, and then it ends up as an order in Epic, and then either gets dispensed by the hospital pharmacy or by, say, an outpatient CVS. And so Washington needs to shift and think differently about the FDA, because the FDA is what is shaping healthcare. So everything that I prescribe has an FDA label for a drug. That drug label then ends up in UpToDate, which the medical student or the resident looks up and tells me what it's used for. And so whether the FDA realizes it or not, the FDA is setting clinical standards. It's setting engineering standards. It's setting surgical standards. It's setting procedural standards. It's setting manufacturing standards. And I put patient-oriented at the end because I worked at the FDA. I escaped. I was a reviewer in Cedar, one of the few who got out. I remember when I joined Cedar, one of my friends who worked for Cedar H, she was a reviewer, and she warned me, and she said, "Brian," I said, "What?" She said, "Be careful." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "If you stay for more than a year or two, you will stay forever. You will become part of the machine." And I said, "What are you talking about? What's going on, Roxy?" And she said, "Well, I stayed for 1 year." And I said, "You've been here 20. And she said, "Exactly." Now, that's a good and it's a bad thing, right? Because if you're sitting on top of a therapeutic area, you see a lot. But the challenge is that you then get removed from the patient. You then get removed from clinical practice, right? Half of all prescribing is off-label use. People innovate based upon their experience in the operating room. So the FDA, whether it realizes it or not, sets the standards for how we practice medicine. It doesn't regulate the practice of medicine. And they always say we don't regulate the practice of medicine. Off-label use is not our concern. But they do set that clinical and scientific standard. And so what the FDA really needs to be is better, faster, cheaper. And there are three things: cultural change, reorientation and reorganization. I sound like a McKinsey consultant there for a second. And then oversight and revitalization. And ironically, better, faster, cheaper is what patients want. What's the average? Anyone know the average time for a primary care appointment in the US? I looked it up before I came here. It's 20.6 days. The average time to see a cardiologist? 26 days. So imagine if you have heart failure, you're not feeling well, your opportunity is to go to the cardiologist in 26 days or go to the emergency room. What happens if there were a remote patient monitoring tool? Wouldn't that be great? You could get care at home, you could talk to a nurse practitioner over the phone, or imagine if there were an algorithm that took into account all of your data, your weights, your medications, your diet, and could tell you if you were having a heart failure exacerbation, where to go. This is all possible. So, thinking about cultural change, I always think about The Office and how culture eats strategy for lunch. It's a problem. The FDA, you do not get rewarded if you promote innovation. The culture of the FDA is you go about your tasks. You go about your work, and I was a reviewer. You get INDs, you get NDAs, you get post-market safety issues. You log onto the server, you open up your email, and every day you show up and you're overwhelmed. And so the FDA needs to change its attitude. It needs to go from an adversary to a partner. So the goal of a product reviewer, whether it's in devices, whether it's in drugs, whether it's in biologics, is to facilitate innovation. It's not to sit there and go through the NDA template or the 510K template. The goal should be, and this has to come from leadership, to be a partner with the entrepreneur, small company, big company, and say, what is it that you're trying to do? How are you trying to change clinical medicine? What is the science and engineering behind what you are doing? How can we help you get there? How can you design a trial differently? What do you need to prove? And that doesn't mean that you as the company send in a request and then you get a scheduled meeting 45 days later, or a written response to questions 32 days later. That's not a facilitator. That's checking the box. So what the FDA needs to do is it needs to be a partner. And part of that means that the FDA needs to transform how it thinks about the review process. So clinical review. This is a picture of my old office. Very happy place, right? As you can see, look at all the wonderful color and excitement. So I joke that FDA review, and they take pride in this, and this is what needs to change to make this possible. It is an artisanal craft. It is going back to like the 1500s with the loom, and you're making sweaters, except it's 2024. Could you imagine how expensive and slow it would be to get clothes? So functionally, when you're a reviewer at the FDA, you are doing basic tasks. I cannot tell you. I constructed tables. I constructed the table of tables, right? There were 90. I calculated mean, median, and mode as a medical officer, as a reviewer at Cedar. Do we need to pay someone $200,000 a year with Title 38 or Title 42 pay to calculate mean, median, and mode? Is that a good use of the reviewer? Does that help the company create innovation? I think we could all agree it doesn't. So the FDA needs to change and think about this as a process. I know it's ironic that I'm talking about process for a regulatory agency. It has plenty of process. It needs to automate the first layer of review. They should have a standard set of analyses that are automatically done and pre-programmed. Cedar doesn't have that. Cedar H doesn't have that. CBER doesn't have that. You could do it by therapeutic area. It's very easy. We all know, like I worked in psych products, we all know the questions, we all know the scales. You should not be constructing that from scratch. That is a lot of the reviewer's time. 510K review. There's the third-party review program, which has been in existence for 25 years. This is a program that needs to be tuned up so that the FDA can focus on moderate risk and high risk devices. If we promote standardization, if we promote automation, the reviewer is going to have time, and then you can actually have a phone call with a reviewer. I have never heard from a single company that says that they were able to call a reviewer and get a phone call that same week. I've never heard that in a decade of doing health policy. And I can tell you that if you're developing a product, you need answers. If you have a critical question, you can't just wait 3 months. That's 3 months of investor dollars that you're burning. That's 3 months of patent life. That's 3 months of activities put on delay or in a holding pattern. It's just not realistic. And so the FDA essentially needs to be a partner and hold hands with the folks who are developing products. Because at the end of the day, it's that patient who can't walk upstairs. It's the patient who has the rare disease, who has no treatment. The patient with the spinal cord injury who wants to walk again. Those are the people who need innovation. And every day you don't have innovation is a day that that patient doesn't have access. The other thing that the agency needs to do, and it needs leadership to do this, is reorganization. If you want to have fun, you can go on the FDA's website, look at the org chart. So the joke is who has the power in the center? There are two people who have power in a center. One is the reviewer, and you all know this because you develop products, are trying to bring them to market. The other is the center director. The problem is that between that, there are 6 to 7 layers of administrators. So I work in a hospital, right? I practice hospital medicine, and hospitals have this same problem. A lot of nonprofit entities do. There are the people doing the work, and then there are the many layers of people telling the other people how they should do the work. And so the FDA's functional problem is it has heavy middle management. And I'm not talking about middle management that they've hired, MBA from Harvard Business School. I'm talking about the reviewer who has an MD, PhD, who trained at Harvard and Yale, who was a reviewer for 3 or 4 years. And then they got tired of that, and after becoming a reviewer, they became a team leader. And then after they became a team leader, they became a deputy division director. And then after that, they became a division director. And then after becoming a division director, they become an office director. And then after becoming an office director, they joined the super office. And you think I'm joking, but I'm not. And you all, I see a few smiles of recognition in the audience. This is what happens at the FDA. And so before you know it, if you're trying to develop a product, you have a handful of reviewers. There may be 300 reviewers in the Office of New Drugs. And then there are 1,200 people in the Office of New Drugs. And CDRH suffers from the same problem. And so when you review a NDA, BLA, PMA, 510K, it's signed by all kinds of people who have scientific training and clinical training, engineering training, who are not actually involved in reviewing the product. They are not doing the analysis. They're not talking to the company. They're not giving you guidance on how to run your trial or what your engineering controls are. So the FDA functionally needs to take those layers out and return them back to serving the customer. Because the FDA, the job is to facilitate safe and effective innovations so that Americans can have better health. That is the fundamental job of the FDA. And so returning those folks from management back to serving on the front lines, just like in the hospitals that I have worked at, where we need administrators to go back to the bedside to serve patients, is the way to help drive customization. And then the agency needs a performance system. They need to reward innovation. They need to have an internal system where reviewers are rewarded, acknowledged, and then meet patients. Right? Most FDA product reviewers do not see patients anymore. If you're a physician, like many of them have been out of practice for 10 or 20 years, they're very smart, but they don't come into contact with patients, and they don't come into contact with organized medicine. And so they need to create a system where those folks come in at the end of the year. And imagine if you're a reviewer and you approve a new drug for cystic fibrosis. Imagine if you got to meet one of the patients who actually took that drug. Or if you were practicing in clinic part-time. I think that the other thing that's a challenge, and we all saw the LDT rule that came out last year, is that leadership needs to address regulatory zombies. So this is a big problem at the FDA. There are thousands of rules and regs and guidance documents. And you can unnecessarily trip over one if you're trying to be creative and innovative. Whether it's the LDT rule, whether it's how you measure outcomes assessment. So a classic example at the FDA, movement disorders. It was a small, scrappy company. I reviewed their NDA with one of my friends, and we all remember the company because they were creative. They said, I want to videotape patients with movement disorder. And my colleague and I, we were scrappy millennials, we thought, this is great. Patients don't have to drive to the study site, right? There's a standardized scale. This will save money. It'll increase access, right? The trial population will be more diverse. We actually had to fight multiple layers of management to get this approved as a trial design, as part of the NDA. They almost killed the NDA because the company tried to do something different, because there was a guidance document. So the agency needs leadership to address regulatory zombies like that, address the LDT rule, which is a 48-year-old enforcement discretion. Imagine how many rules exist at FDA where there's enforcement discretion that could be changed. You're a company, you've raised millions of dollars, you've done clinical trials, you're about to file your NDA or your 510K, and then before you know it, the FDA changes your policy. I remember I once had a tech company come to me and say, we are fine, I'm not worried about the FDA and our software. And I said, why? And they said, they sent us a letter. And I said, well, the letter says it's non-binding, and also that's just a letter. And they said, no, we're good. I said, well, what happens if the person in that review division changes? And they said, oh, that's not going to happen. I said, well, what happens if they got hit by a bus? Right? That's regulatory uncertainty. And so the FDA needs to have leaders who create clear policies and transparency. This is the hardest one. Oversight. Science is hard, clinical medicine is hard, engineering is hard. The FDA needs to partner with Congress to solve problems. What does that mean? An example is software. This is the one where I get thousands of questions. Software is a medical device. How do you regulate it? I practice medicine, and everything I do is manual. I'm going to be working in the hospital over Thanksgiving week, and it's like flying a 747 with analog controls. There's no digital controls. There's no autopilot. Thank God we have pharmacists who double-check our orders. My sister's a pharmacist, so I'm partial to them. But software can transform how we practice medicine. Software-driven medical devices. Imagine if you got a knee replacement and it had a running mode. I think that'd be great, right? If we could become the Borg, like in Star Trek, it's possible. But there's no regulatory pathway to market. Or diabetes. If you're diabetic, it's burdensome. You have to give yourself shots every day. You have to give yourself basal insulin in the morning or the evening. You have to give yourself shots with lunch, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So 4 shots a day. You have to check your blood multiple times a day. Thank God we have continuous glucose monitors. Makes it easier. We have insulin pumps. But then you have to carb count. Carb counting is hard. I'm a physician. I completed 2 residencies. I would struggle to carb count. It's challenging. Imagine if we had software that could take a picture of your food, carb count for you, and then auto-dose your insulin. Imagine what diabetic compliance would be. It'd be easy to be a diabetic. It'd be like the iPhone. It's possible. Is there a regulatory pathway to market for that product? Well, I wondered about this, so I called one of my friends who's a consultant. And I said, oh, it's very easy. And I said, okay, tell me what's going to happen. They said, well, you file a 510K. I said, great. And they said, well, that's just the 510K for the pump. You then do a 510K for the pump and the CGM. And I said, okay. And they said, well, then you do another 510K for the pump, the CGM, and the software. And I said, well, this doesn't really sound great. And they said, no, it's fine. I can charge fees. So the FDA needs a new framework to review software. And it needs to not be pre-market, post-market. They need a total process life cycle approach, and they need standards. So imagine if the FDA had Lego building blocks, and you said, I want to get this new product for diabetics approved. The FDA could take a look and say, well, this insulin pump is substantially equivalent to the prior one. The CGM is, your software, performance validated. And then I'm looking at the whole product, I, the reviewer. That would be life-changing, right? Because no company is going to file 3 510Ks. It's not realistic. Or in this case, it'd probably be multiple 510Ks and a PMA. Pardon. So, as the consequence, thank you. Pardon. So the FDA needs to partner with Congress to do this, and industry needs to step up and do this, because otherwise we're never going to get that software-driven world, and software can eat the world, and it should eat up clinical medicine. My life and patients' lives would be 1,000 times better with more software and more software-driven devices. Liability is another concern. If I have software and automation in a device or either standalone, who's liable if I use it? Am I liable as the physician? Is the patient liable because they used it poorly? Is the health system liable because they deployed it in the wrong way? This is a question that Congress needs to answer and create a liability shield. But they haven't. This requires leadership from the agency. And so the agency needs to stand up, work with industry, work with entrepreneurs, and approach Congress with a solution. Because if you don't have a regulatory barrier, if you don't have a regulatory path to the marketplace, your product's dead. You can't raise money, you're not going to get into clinical trials, and then patients will never benefit. As we talked about, there are thousands of needs, and the agency can transform itself from, instead of the public health guardian, right, the barrier to the market, a facilitator of innovation. Because clinical practice and being a patient shouldn't be hard. It's hard enough to be sick. I had bronchitis a few weeks ago, as you all can tell. It was not fun. But heart failure, COPD, metastatic cancer, whatever the issue is that you face as a patient, people don't realize it is tiring. You are exhausted. It is expensive. It is cumbersome. It is inconvenient. And everyone just wants healthcare to be better, faster, and cheaper. That's what the FDA needs to do with its product review. Through reorientation, reorganization, cultural change, and then partnering with Congress. So I want to spend some time talking with you all, taking your questions, because I worked for 4 regulatory agencies. I also serve on MedPAC, that's the congressional advisory body for the Medicare program. Since I said that, I have to say my views are my own and not those of MedPAC's. And we need to think differently about the FDA. Because the FDA historically has talked about real-world evidence, goes to conferences, tells you that everything's going to be fine, there's a new program, right? User fees, gave them more staff. And then your experience as the entrepreneurs and innovators hasn't changed. You still have the same problems. Reviewers are inconsistent. You're waiting 35 days to get a meeting scheduled. I was just talking to someone, and they told me that late in the review process, the FDA requested a 5-year trial, or 5-year follow-up, which is sort of ridiculous before market entry. And so the FDA needs to get back to the basics and remember that its mission is for patients and that its mission is to facilitate safe and effective innovation. And so as an industry, if you all push for that cultural change at the FDA and say the goal of the FDA is to facilitate safe and effective innovation, and you push for middle management to be crushed out of the FDA and say, I'm not going to pay user fees for middle management. I'm not going to pay for a physician to make $250,000 a year to be a deputy director of something. I'm paying for reviewers who are reviewing my products. If you push and say, I don't want reviewers constructing Excel tables. I want them having conversations with me about trials. I want them having conversations with me about what the standard is in the space and how that needs to change. I want that part of review to be automated, the basic part of review, basic data analysis, and the reviewer shows up and looks at that. That's what you all as industry need to tell Congress, need to tell the agency, and need to tell the world. Because the FDA needs to change from an medieval, artisanal organization to a process and a factory that is reviewing the basics and then working with you to customize what needs to be customized, to have standardization to then promote customization later. And then you all need to go and also tell Congress that they need to work with the FDA to address barriers to innovation. The FDA needs different tools to address software because the current process is broken. There's the predetermined change control guidance, which I'm sure many of you know about. That's going to be insufficient pretty quickly when you get into AI and automation. And that the liability for AI needs to be addressed so that we can unlock that for both patients and also clinicians. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to chat and talk and share some of my thoughts, and look forward to hearing questions from you all.
So I'm going to start it off with a couple of questions for Brian, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Brian, one of the challenges FDA faces is they have certain standards that they have to meet, safety and efficacy. Those are important standards for us and for them. But one of the challenges that I see, and I'd be interested in your thought on how they overcome this, they don't, unlike business who has a profit motive, FDA doesn't have a profit motive. They may have a motive of trying to get product out, and I think Jeff Shuren was a champion of innovation. I think Dr. Tarver's going to be that same kind of a person. But in the end, they are judged more on the mistakes that get made than the innovation that gets promoted. How do you change that culture? How do you help them get to a point where they say, gee, if we push this through and it doesn't work, we're going to be criticized, as opposed to saying we need to take our time and make sure it works so that what gets out there we can't be criticized for?
So 3 interesting ideas. One is the FDA could publish every year, without being specific, a list of therapeutic areas and diseases for which products were denied. Why? Because that would show that innovation that has failed. And then highlight the therapeutic areas and put pressure on those therapeutic areas inside the FDA to look at why that happened and what they need to change. I think the second thing is reviewers need to get back out, who are physicians and pharmacists need to get back out into the clinical setting. I can tell you when I worked after working at the FDA, my clinical practice is totally different. Totally different. It transformed how I view patient care. And so if we take away some of those boring administrative, statistical, and basic analytical tasks from the FDA reviewers, some of those reviewers can get back out into practice and see patients and see the real world and see what's needed. And that changes how you look at things. And I'd say the third thing is The FDA, at the end of every year, needs to bring in patients from every disease that has had a new device or drug approved and have them meet the reviewers.
Interesting thoughts. So second question, then we'll go to, I saw some people wanted to ask some questions out here. Second question. FDA has to work within regulatory, statutory frameworks. They don't just have carte blanche to do whatever they want. They have to stay within that framework. One of the questions I wish I'd have had time to explore with Jeff and Michelle was, how do we take a statutory framework from the 70s and implement it in the 21st century? What statutory changes need to be made? You said advocate with Congress. I mean, FDA has their role in changing culture, but also within the statutory framework. What is the ask that we should make in that statutory framework to change it?
I'd say the ask is for a voluntary alternative pathway built upon Lego building blocks. So those building blocks of products, right, when you integrate them together, you want that product with those components to be either substantially equivalent, similar to 510K, tested in a lab, have some sort of modeling performance, meet a standard, and then not have the reviewer look at those components, but say that those components are fine, and then look at the whole integrated product. That would transform FDA review.
But that means statutory changes. And one of the challenges is we as an industry are complicit in that process because we love certainty.
Right.
You start changing statutory processes, and all of a sudden, there's uncertainty.
Well, I'd say leave 510K and PMA alone and create an alternative. So if product developers want to do that and use the alternative pathway, let them use that alternative pathway. Don't force anybody to.
So saying create statutory guidelines that would allow FDA to create that kind of alternative.
Create a voluntary alternative pathway with that sort of Lego building block approach to regulation.
Would you ever see that alternative pathway being, look, if they're going to follow this pathway, it doesn't rise to the gold standard of FDA approval, but we're saying this can go to market, but buyer beware?
I think that a voluntary alternative pathway like this would prevent the FDA from doing that.
Okay.
Because you could come back and argue and say, well, this component meets this standard, this component was tested in the lab, this component was tested here. All you're doing is performance-based oversight for what that integrated device does.
Okay.
So it's forcing the FDA to look at performance. It's the way I think about it is, I love cars. I'm a car nut, I admit it. It's terrible. I drive a convertible. My convertible has a rollover bar. It's one of the first. No one said to Mercedes, you're going to take 300 convertibles and flip them and see what happens, right? That's not how it got through the NHTSA. The rollover bar met standards that has a hydraulic system, and maybe a couple of them were crashed. That's the type of approach that the FDA needs to think about for regulation, for devices in particular. Performance-based regulation is built upon that. And so what that does, and even in today's world, actually, you could model that crash rather than actually flip the Mercedes.
Right.
And so that's the approach that would allow the FDA to approve new types of software in a medical device, right, or an integrated device. And that would then make sure that the FDA doesn't go back to its risk-averse approach, because you'd be forcing them to follow performance-based regulation.
Okay. Let's go to some of the questions. We had a question here.
Yeah, I think that last answer is super helpful. And so my name is Warren Patine. I'm an assistant professor at University of Utah and have a medical AI company. And so my question is specifically about the regulation of software as a device. If you look at Google or Amazon or Meta, they're retraining their models constantly. They make them specific for geographical regions, for demographics, et cetera. And that's why they're really good, is they have continuous deployment, right? We need that for medicine, for remote patient monitoring, in the sense that if a flu goes through a population, the performance of the models is going to be affected. If it's trained on a population in Utah, it's not going to work as well in Queens, New York. What's a regulatory framework that you can see, and maybe kind of a tangible version of that, that allows us to do good machine learning in medicine?
I'd say performance-based regulation, but also decentralized. So the answer is, you look at how a model is performing. If that model is performing well in a population in Utah, you can use that on similar, it's externally generalizable. So I would use a performance-based regulatory model for software, specifically for AI, which is why I was thinking about that.
So would that mean then reporting performance of the models on like a quarterly basis, or?
You mean what would the post-market regulatory framework look like?
Yeah,
So
because if I'm retraining my models, every couple days after the initial interaction with the FDA, and that's like inherently a part of the process itself.
So I think you would want the FDA, in theory, you'd want the FDA to review the performance of the initial model, right? And that you could tie that to a medical device liability shield, for example. And then the drift of the model over time in clinical practice, you could have that liability be on the health system that uses it. So you could split that liability between the manufacturer and the health system rather than just dumping it on the manufacturer or just dumping it on the health system.
I would say that framework really is creating a barrier in remote patient monitoring, because it makes it difficult then for the company to work with providers, et cetera, because then they're like, well, it's not really FDA approved if the burden has to be shifted. Right?
Well, I'm saying it could still be initially FDA approved, still would be FDA approved, and then it would change in the real world. And that's actually okay. You want innovation to occur in the real world. You don't want the FDA to get in the way of software innovation in the real world. So I'm saying that what you don't want is you don't want FDA post-market regulation to destroy growth and innovation in software. You want the FDA, the way I think about it is, you want the FDA maybe looking at Windows 95 or Windows 2000. You don't want them looking at Windows 2000 release 3.
So and maybe we can carry this on offline, because I'm sure a lot of people have questions, but would Windows 2000 not be FDA approved then? Would it just be like, oh, we had XP back in the day that was, our latest version isn't, but
no, you would still want it to be. But I'm saying you don't want what's currently proposed by the current FDA framework, which is a aggressive software post-market regulation where you must have reporting to a central authority. You want that innovation decentralized and deregulated. So you want the FDA to maybe, one, have a garden of clear software it doesn't look at and doesn't need to, and they have done some enforcement discretion on that, and also 21st Century Cures scoped out some software, right? A lot of software is probably low or moderate risk, if we think about it using the current framework. Not much of it is necessarily high risk, and you don't want the FDA sitting there in the hospital, you do not want them looking at the next sets of 10, 12 versions of your software. You want them to just look at the performance of the initial model.
Cool, thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks for coming and explaining all this. This has been really helpful. I asked a question earlier to the FDA guys regarding, I got an emergency use authorization through for a ventilator back in COVID. During that process, we basically met every week with the FDA, and what we would have taken 6 months, 9 months, or even longer to get the ventilator through the market, it took us 6 weeks. And we provided all the same safety and effectiveness questions and answers and all of that. So you having been a reviewer previously, what is holding the FDA back from having that kind of model where they're able to work more efficiently with industry to move this process, this review process through the whole thing? Again, still providing the same result, but at the end of the day, it was so much quicker. We didn't have to wait for those 32 days or 72 days or all of those things.
So part of what probably you experienced in a good way is them shoving a bunch of other work aside and prioritizing your EUA.
Some of the other reviewer groups did lose a lot of reviewers and took longer.
And not even just using reviewers, the FDA slipped on a lot of sort of standard reviews during COVID when they were prioritizing other things. But the prioritization of other products like yours showed that the FDA can be nimble and accessible and do that. I would say that the key to making sure that that becomes the standard is, again, de-burdening the reviewer of tasks that they don't need to do, which take up at least 50, 60, 70% of their time, And then also increasing the number of reviewers, not by increasing user fees for industry, but by pushing the middle management, technical trained folks down back onto the front line of reviews. Because if you do that, I mean, if 1/4 of your staff are actually involved in core review work, that's a problem. It's like in the hospital, as a hospitalist, if I want to change something in the electronic health record, I can tell you the 3 committees I have to go to, and probably the 5, administrators, managers, and then executives it has to go to, which is not a good use of my time as someone who has to do frontline service. And so the agency has forgotten that its job is to review products and facilitate innovation. And so I think if you do those 2 things, deburden the reviewers and flatten the hierarchy and push folks back down into the review roles, you could actually, not just you, but everyone else could get that customized experience. Because it should be like that. You should be able to get a weekly meeting. You should be able to have a conversation. You should be able to pick up the phone and get a meeting in a couple days, and you can't.
Yeah.
It should be the standard.
So a follow-up on that then is, what are those higher echelons doing if they're not doing the reviewing? Are they just managing the reviews? Because you're right, they sign, you get signatures of people you never met or even talked to, yet they're the ones signing off on it, and they have no other involvement other than that.
So the truth is being a reviewer is a really hard job. I will say that being a reviewer is actually harder than working in the ICU as an internal medicine resident. And I say that because it's the stress, the tasks, everything just piles on. It's literally like a fire hose aimed at your face. And the reason it is like a fire hose is because, again, they haven't automated, they haven't deburdened. And so as a result is a lot, and this is what has happened. Cedar is the best example. This has happened a little bit at CDRH, not as much. But what happens is you're a reviewer for a year, you're excited. Then your second year, you start to get a little tired. And then your third or fourth year, you start to get burned out and a little angry, right? And you maybe have a little bit too much of the donuts from the cafeteria because you're stressed. And then by year 5, you say, I want a new job, but I don't want to leave the agency. I don't want to disrupt my family. I don't want to, move and redo all my licensing and board certification, et cetera. And so you try and go into management. You try and go into another office, right? Like a famous office in Cedar is the Office of Lifecycle Management. Many of us don't know what they do. And I'm not saying that to be rude, but we don't as reviewers. And so you've had management bloat, where you have multiple layers of people who look at reviews and check your work, but don't do the work. And then you have a lot of offices, and some offices are needed to do things like manufacturing inspections and other areas. But you have lots of offices that don't have a clear mission-driven focus, and lots of layers of middle management that are essentially reviewing the review of someone who reviewed your work. And so if we eliminate that, there's huge potential in the agency.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, Brian, we're down to about a minute left. I guess one of the challenges that they face also is the huge turnover. I mean, FDA has been around since, at least CDRH has been around since '76. A lot of reviewers are hitting that retirement, and we're seeing a huge turnover. So maybe it's an opportunity to improve culture, like you're saying at that point, but it's also a real challenge to make sure that you get the properly trained people at that reviewer level, which maybe argues in favor of what you're saying of giving some of the more experienced people to be more mentors.
Get the experienced people down, and then also if you make that review job better, right? If your job as a reviewer is facilitating innovation, and you're reviewing a basic analysis, and you're talking with companies, giving advice on trials, giving advice on what to do, right? Like that example I gave with movement disorders. That's exciting. And then you meet patients at the end of the year for a product that you approved. If you could meet that patient, like the first couple patients who took the drug or benefited from the new surgical device, that's a huge reward. That makes that job fun, because it's fun from a scientific perspective, but then it makes it real for you. And if you're a reviewer and you have that, that's a much easier job to hire for. Like, because you have that, not just, because reviewers are not there to make money. They're there to do things, and they're there to promote science and innovation and protect the public health, as they say. And so if you create that system where you've spent many months reviewing an NDA or a PMA or 510K, and then you meet the patient who benefited from that new cardiac catheter, right? And you get an opportunity to talk to them. Or you talk to the first couple interventional cardiologists who used it and they tell you how it's better. And then maybe you practice part-time and you get to experience that yourself. That transforms that job.
They almost have some ownership in the outcome.
They have ownership of clinical innovation.
Yeah.
And then
Maybe we need
partner.
to figure out how to put innovation statutorily into the process, because I think there's been an effort. I know Jeff even mentioned that one of their goals was to make sure that people bring innovation to America first instead of anywhere else. So there is that mindset, but we maybe need to gird that up with more statutory strength.
Right, and making people excited again.
Yeah.
Right, because if the reviewers are excited, that'll make it much easier.
Yeah.
There's nothing worse than calling up a regulatory agency, trying to get something done, and the person you're talking to is tired, sad, depressed, and overworked. Right? Like, that's not what you want. That's not what they want either.
Right.
And so if you make that job exciting for them again, because the FDA, as I said, whether it realizes it or not, the FDA is creating that clinical standard, scientific standard, that engineering standard by serving as that gatekeeper. If we turn that into a partner rather than an adversary, that would be transformative.
Let's give Brian a round of applause. Thank you,
Thank
Brian.
you. Thank you.
Great.